Hello, good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. We are live. We got a couple of streams going on, including YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, maybe LinkedIn. And so I'm David DeVore with Props. We've also got my partner here, Calvin Hoenes. And, we are incredibly excited tonight to talk about vibe coding. And, we've been doing quite a bit of it ourselves. Also have been running into the challenges, the perils. We've been hearing assorted stories on Reddit and other places where it's gone incredibly right as well as incredibly wrong. And we've been talking to people and whatnot. And so we wanted to crack open the topic of vibe coding and talk about the perils of vibe coding, but also talk about how to solve them more importantly, because we think there's both a tremendous opportunity here for product people, for developers, for non-developers. It's really a brand new and very fun mechanism for building into the world. First of all, vibe coding. Andre Karpathy coined the term, right? So basically, and he's sort of goat of AI and machine learning from Tesla and doctorate from Stanford and was early in OpenAI and whatnot. And vibe coding is, essentially using AI to support engineering and development and moving very, very rapidly through building things, right? And so that's both a challenge as well as an opportunity because you can, of course, build something and make it live in the world very fast. But of course, there can also be a number of problems in the mix. And so, to be clear, we are anything but anti-AI. For us, it's really about smarter AI and how do we get AI to do what we want. And so, in this episode, we're going to just cover some common pitfalls, practical solutions, and so forth. So the first thing that I think that we want to crack open here is architecture and maintainability challenges, right? So, the challenges with, and this is true, I actually built not one, but two. I have a great barn. I built not one, but two ladders. The first ladder I built out 2x4s, did it really fast in like an hour. And it was structurally dangerous. My kids didn't want to get on it. And so this is similar to vibe coding. Like anything that you do too fast, and AI allows us to go very fast, you can really create some very some design challenges, right? Whether it's spaghetti code or technical debt, code duplication, right? And there was some NYU research showing architectural weaknesses in AI generated code. Was also just last week there was somebody who had built an app and it was pretty quickly it was he didn't know in the process of building his app, he just didn't know these things like that, things like environmental like vars and how do you deal with security around databases and making sure that API endpoints are closed, or that certain pieces of data ought to be encrypted and whatnot. So we're starting to hear these horror stories, and it's no surprise. And so, Calvin, let's break down what we think in terms of the sort of immediate solution around how do we deal with architectural challenges? Like what's the best practices here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we love the vibe coding, right? It's this amazing feeling when you're sitting there and, you just prompt it away and you want this feature and you want that feature, right? And you keep adding stuff and it just, does a thing and it's awesome, right? We've never built software as fast as we did now. What's interesting though is if you look into an LLM and how sort of most tools, whether you're working with Cursor or Replit or Lovable, right? Any of the tools out there, pick Rosebud if you're working on games. The step or what you will often find is that as you keep growing your code base or as you keep growing your project, there's a lot of weird things that the AI does, right? Like I can give you one very, very practical example, right? So let's say you build your chat function, right? And it starts doing this chat TS, right? And it might sort of, because you're in a let's say, Next.js environment, it kind of puts it into, let's say, it puts it into a server directory, right? And then you maybe have your route where your actual front end happens, right? And then you have your chat TSX, or whichever framework you're working in, and now you have this cool chat, and also you have an awesome AI chat, and it's all going great, right? And now you kind of prompt the AI, and you say like, hey, make me a new way to chat with messages. And so what happens now is like a lot of the times this might go right? But if you don't have any specific boundaries, and I'll get into that in a second, what the AI will happily do, it'll be like, yeah, let me make a chat file. And all of a sudden what it does is it creates, a library folder. And even though it sort of searches your code base, sometimes it doesn't find the right context, or it doesn't know where to look, right? Because it's just the LLM prompting. So it might do like this, right? And all of a sudden we land in a territory where, your code gets like deduplicated, copied, you have it in 5 places, right? The other extreme is like you have your chat file, and the AI is like, okay, cool, let me add that new feature to it, right? Like, make me a new way. And then what happens is, okay, cool, I'll make you a new way, no problem, right? But this chat file ends up getting longer and longer, right? And longer and longer, and so on and so forth. And what you end up with, as soon as you crack, the 500, 600, 700 lines, or, 1,000 lines of context, you will quickly realize, especially when you work in Cursor, all of those lovely things happen where all of a sudden it deleted 900 lines of your code, or it writes the same function 3 times, or, it puts the function here but names it slightly different and it puts it here. And it still kind of works in a lot of the cases, right? So you don't realize it immediately, especially if you're not a developer and you're just like vibe coding your way. And most of my friends that are vibe coding now, I have more and more conversations where when we have a chat about their project, they're like, oh, this is actually the first time I'm looking at my code. Let me see how it works, right? Because they were just like prompting the way and actually vibe coding. And so in those scenarios, you end in all those weird whirlwinds where as your project progresses, this is fine for a cool prototype in like the first 3 hours, right? But as soon as you hit like day 3, 4, 5, or 6, you'll end up in all those vast loopholes, and you actually stop understanding what's going wrong. And also, you confuse the LLM itself, right? Because the LLM, when you give it a new feature, now let's say I come back the next day and I say like, yeah, I want my chats to stream to Twitch. An example, but you get the drift. Now the LLM is going to start and try and find chats, right? The code for chats. And so like, is it here, right? Or is this actually my context? Or wait, hold on, we actually had this long project here, right? And so you can see what I mean. Like, and now imagine this not being your 2-minute prototype that you played with on your local host a little bit, but imagine it sort of being your production app and extrapolate it 2 to 3 weeks out. And you can quickly see we're coming into a land where you have so much code deduplication and the AI confuses itself by the code it created. And that whole problem gets even worse if the AI, if the model gets an update. So let's say you've built a lot of your code with Claude 3.5. Now Claude 3.7 comes out and goes over your code and has a different way of wrapping it. Or let's say Cursor gets an update. They've changed their system prompt on how it works. And so it looks at your code base differently. And now you have the scenario that the new model would have totally structured differently. So we're in a weird world. So that's 2 big problems here. It's like 1, code duplication, and 3, losing context on large files. That had happened to everybody. Now, the third thing is sort of that if you don't give your AI like good guidance, right? Like just, I want a new feature. Some LLMs will tend towards complex content. So this could be, your AI does likes classes. Could also be that you use another model and all of a sudden your model thought like less class, but more like function-based, right, would be better, and it does my function like this, right? And so now you end up with your code base that has like 10 different coding styles, 20 different types in 50 different files. So, and that, as I said, is fine, but if you're 3 months down the road, like for a prototype, but if you're 3 months down the road, you'll be in utter pain. Right. And I've seen that over and over and over in the conversations that we have with vibe coders, is exactly that pain. And so the example is basically like, I got started, right? Like day 1 is like, you're like super happy. right? Like your big love, right? And then week or month two comes around, and you're just gonna be in like utter pain and crying your heart out, right? Trying to figure out what's going on in your software.
Well, yeah, and you actually don't even have and I found that too. Like if I let the AI move too quickly, I don't know what it's done. And then I'm spending time having to even figure out the right questions to ask it or where to point it to solve the problem. And so, and I've heard, and I've seen some articles, I've heard this, people like some seasoned software developers being like, fuck this is just taking me longer in the end than if I had just done it right from the beginning.
Exactly. Yeah, and if you're a developer, that's annoying, but okay, right? So you go and like scrap it, or you actually go in and change the function. If you're not a developer, like, what are you going to do, right?
Right. Yeah, you're done. Yep. Yeah, and it's it's interesting because it's like all of the basics are still here, but like I think sometimes we just are jumping over. It's like me and my ladder. Like I knew I was moving too fast because I was like trying to get it done before I had like a meeting or something like that. I just wanted it out of the way, and so I didn't properly measure things. I was just like, so it's like good design is still good design.
100%.
Right? And
100%.
so,
like good architecture still matters a lot. Planning matters a lot. And there's nothing wrong with the vibes, right? But you get just 10x better results, especially in the mid and long term, if you do planning.
Yeah, 100%. And so there's the planning, and you shared an article earlier, and as we sort of think about like, well, what goes into planning architecture, right? Like, I think that's a useful, like, what are the, like, before even asking Replit or Cursor to do something, what do you think are the core pieces of planning that need to take that should?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because you can still also do your planning with the AI, right? Like even if you're somebody who doesn't know how all of that works, you can still do that. It's just very vital that when you're in Cursor, don't just go haywire on the agent mode, or at least tell it to not write code from the beginning, but have a conversation as to what you want to plan, even if you don't know the actual terminology. It would, to your question, it helps a lot knowing the actual terminology. And all of this is like just the best practices of software development that we've had for decades. Right? There's nothing new. The AIs were trained on that too. So one good example is, the product requirements document. Classical, right? Write your PRDs, right? Work with the agent to create architectural diagrams. If you did that in Claude or in Cursor, they can both handle mermaid documents now. So they will actually visualize the architectural diagrams for you. And even if you have not worked with, creating systems or ERD diagrams before, talk to it, diagram out the structure, think about sort of from the inside from the core outwards. All right. So, okay, you start with your core user description. You go into the architectural study of it, like what are the objects, what is everything that I want? And you would not want that to immediately result in code, just because, once you stated the first result, boom, Cursor starts coding. So go get out of agent mode, do the planning, get diagrams, get product requirements, specification document. And the most important thing is number 3 is document it, right? Make sure that if you write it with the agent, it needs to go into Markdown files into your repository. If you're working with Cursor, you can put it into the .cursor/rules folder. Cursor has an extension now which is very helpful. So they don't have Markdown files, but they have MDC, so the Markdown Cursor files, which allow you to set settings of where to automatically apply those documents. Auto-globbing is what it's called. So automatically, when you're in a chat with an agent, it would automatically attach those documents. And you have various settings from, attach it always, attach it only for certain file types, attach it only in certain scenarios, or you could even tell the agent to ask you what should be attached. And so you basically start out with planning. The plan means ideally you create PRDs. Right? You want the PRDs to get in, probably the architectural diagrams first. Let's put them here, right? So your architectural diagrams, right? And really explain the use case. What is it going to do? And create the PRDs. And as always, sorry.
I was going to say user stories inside of.
Right. Create user stories.
Yeah. So for those who don't know what is a user story, it's basically the format is just saying, as a user, I can do this thing. And typically when we do software planning, we try and get very, very granular. So, it's like if it is a single, it's not everything on the screen. It's like a button, right? As a user, I can exit this page, right? So
100%.
Very, very granular user stories of the experience that you want somebody to go through, or the feature that you want them to be able to interact.
100%. And I think a lot of users or a lot of people that are VibeCoding would probably say, maybe also, I don't know all the stories that will come. And what I've seen more and more is the same thing, that people actually start with the user story. So the user stories are very important, like you said. I think it's also important that they come slightly later in the you want to describe them in the beginning for your planning so that the agent has enough of the context. But when you get into the detailed step, slice them a slight bit later. Part of the thinking behind that is that, if you give an LLM a context of just one or two specific user stories, it'll create the architectural diagram and everything around just those user stories.
Just those
it's
two.
The same, yeah, right, because that's all it knows. So if you start, you open your cursor, like, as a user, I want this app to do X, Y, and Z, then what's going to happen is what we had before. As soon as you add the next user story or the next user story, it kind of becomes this Frankenstein of attached user stories if you do not have your architectural diagrams, the PRDs, and the planning step before that. So all of those together are very important. And like we said, document and store them, right? At this point, you have sort of a good planning basis.
You mentioned for Cursor the files that support. Are those the ones that are on cursor.directory? Is that the same thing that you're?
Yeah. So the on cursor.directory, those are basically examples of those rule sets. And cursor.directory is a great resource, right, to look at all those examples. They're kind of going a little bit more into MCP directory now, so more like model context protocol. They're doing a little bit of a pivot here, but they still have very valuable resources on cursor.directory when it comes to just general rule sets for, React, SvelteKit, etc. And this is a great point that we haven't touched on here that I might add. And it's not step 6, but it's important, is if you have the chops and if you know what you want, right? Like, what's your technical stack? That's another important thing to document. If you have a preference, right, that really depends on your skills. Like we, for example, we don't use Next, right? We are SvelteKit people, so I have to prompt that, and we're not using ShadCN for components, for component libraries, but we prefer other ways, or straight up Tailwind or Radix or whatever you're using. So if you have preferences on your tech stack, also document that and put that into the doc.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't know this at first. So Replit, if you are starting an app from scratch inside of Replit, you can use Replit agent. And it works very well, but they're gonna you're like, hey, I want to create an app that does this, and I think it's all React. I'm pretty sure it's all React, and they sort of have their defined stack that they're going to kick off of what it is. I've also found, like with Cursor, if you don't have it can be technically challenging to get all of the directories and everything loaded onto your local machine, depending on, to make sure you have the right versions of Svelte or the right version of Tailwind, and getting all the directories loaded and making sure that there's no conflicts and so forth sometimes can be the hardest part. And so, I sort of liked that with Replit, they sort of took that away from me, right? And because Replit is a hosted version, it was sort of like nice to just not have to worry about the technical stack and just say, I want this app. Now, clearly, if this is just messing around and playing with it while I'm at the basketball game or whatnot, and they have a great mobile app. But, if it's something that is going to be an app that lives and is more than just sort of a proof of concept or a game or a learning experience, it's definitely something that the technical stack matters more and more, right? Because we quickly get into the architecture of scalability, right? And how something goes from a single user to potentially thousands of users. And those are different, and also maintains, and they're very different, right? And I'm not sure that I've yet to be convinced that Replit is ready to do enterprise software, whereas Cursor is, more in tune to sort of support. I'm calling enterprise software. It doesn't necessarily mean enterprise, but something that scales, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. And I guess we'll also get to like scaling in a minute, because it's a very specific topic that I think is often very not being talked enough about, right? In terms of, the vibe coding sort of side of the fence. To just quickly wrap up the sort of the planning side of things, I think one thing that we haven't talked about yet, which comes with everything that we had before, is sort of the issues around sort of quality control and design often, right? Like one of the really important things that is often forgotten, I think, in this age where branding becomes even more important is, have a, and I'm going to cover this here quickly, is, have a design system, right? That's one thing, regardless if you're in Replit or wherever you are, right? Plan your design beforehand, right? You don't want to end up with 7 different sort of buttons. Even if Replit does an amazing job at that, right? It can still veer off, and it's important if you do that for like a distinction in the beginning, 100%.
Yeah, and Figma is still really great for, I think that like people got excited about like, drawing an app on a piece of paper, taking a picture, and it's works remarkably well to go from like a sketch to an app. At the same time, I think that you really lose the time to think about user experience. And if you're building something that's like multifaceted, multi-page, multiple pieces of navigation, different paths that a user can take through the app or different outcomes, you really want to take time to think about that user experience, spend upfront. And if you don't know Figma, Figma's got a number of very easy drag and drop modules these days. They also have AI in Figma that'll help build, but definitely I agree, like take the time to do a design system and really think through the steps and what that experience looks like. I would also say one more thing, just in terms of design, and you were talking about this on Friday. It's in line with sort of glitchy outcomes and quality issues and whatnot. When you can make code as fast as you can, it's easy to want to throw every feature at this stuff. You're like, but I could do this and I could do this other thing and I can make it go this way and that way. And the feature creep is real. You all of a sudden, and I think if you don't, word to the wise, like you are creating a Frankenstein, in potentially in the process. So
yeah, that's a very good point, right? So now, like, once you're out of the like planning phase and stuff, and especially in those, but in the planning phase too, right? You really want to get yourself out of that mode of just like adding feature to it, right? Like, product rules still apply. You definitely want you need to have your audience in mind. You need to actually get it in front of the audience, and you need to solve the specific pain point. If you're dog fooding, if you're doing it for yourself, even better, right? You know that. But that runaway feature creep we've seen to like now 10x to 100x is wild. Right? Like all of those. Yeah, I've had so many people show me like sub menu after sub menu after sub menu after sub feature after sub feature after sub feature, and I've literally stopped listening to those calls after 2 or 3 minutes because it's like, okay, it's amazing, right? It's great that you can build all this exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Go with your users, right?
Well, and it also, I mean, it's also just in it. There's this saying which is there's a saying in software which I love, which is there are no small changes, and this is especially true with in coding with AI because by definition it will make the smallest change. It can also, as you add features and you add capabilities, and like all of a sudden this thing balloons into what was a small change, all because some can become a big problem, and then you're spending hours trying to figure out where it messed up.
Yeah.
And in the process, you can even trying to get it to go back and fix where it got messed up. You mess up more stuff and more stuff and more stuff. So
yeah. And it's all, I think it's always like less is better, right? Like that like, sure, some products have a min requirement now because like the expectation of a user is so much higher, that the baseline requirements need to be set when it comes to authentication, everything. But most of the tools like Superbase or so make that so simple for you to like tack on everything in seconds that part is covered. But when it comes, like you said, to the core of your product, you want to keep it to the absolute core of it, and not just because of the classic rules of building a great product, right? But also for your own sanity, because the bigger your code base grows, we still have high context, like short context limits of LLMs. So the bigger your code base grows, the more you're going to run into problems of maintenance, maintainability, and everything. And as soon as you have users on it and something at the back of your app starts breaking, you're going to spend time on the wrong things for sure.
True.
I think you get to a very good step, right? That's like we talked a lot about sort of the architectural side of things, but like I think two of the important things that maybe make sense to talk about here is sort of the quality control aspect and the scaling aspect of it, right? Because that's something that is often not talked about in the vibe coding. Like especially when we have the scenario where you build like feature after feature, right, after feature, and you just keep on tacking on features. I think one of the important things that we just tucked on is how do you ensure that your quality stays maintained, right? That not sort of all of a sudden this one button doesn't work and this doesn't work, etc. And we can go back to the classical standard practices of good software development, which is testing. Sounds simple. I have yet to see vibe coders do that by default. I know some who are the better coders who do that. Most don't, right? So the classical approach is like you don't have to go what's called full TDD or test-driven development, but at least have some sort of testing in your app. And you can do that. You can do that with the agents too. You can do that in Replit. You can do it in Cursor. You can do it everywhere. You can prompt the agent to create tests for the feature that it's creating with the features while you're creating them. And that is very important. That is not yet full TDD. Test-driven development is a little bit different because it means that you write your tests first and then the feature against it. So that is sort of the ideal, because then you can have your AI reason about how it should behave. And you basically define your guardrails, how it should behave. And then you can work in the feature. And whenever you do, just run the tests and make sure it works. That is a very, very important aspect.
In terms of like practically, when we talk about running a test, right? Is this, and a lot of times when people are thinking about tests and they're looking at tests, they're looking at a GUI, right? They're going like, did this button work? Did it successfully put the entry into the database or bring the right thing up on screen? Practically, when you get in and start talking about writing tests, like what would you suggest to sort of help somebody move quickly through that?
Well, there's essentially there's a lot more types of tests. The main sorts of tests are still, your unit tests and your end-to-end tests, right? That's like a good baseline to start, right? And for the unit tests, you're really looking at the sort of each function or maybe feature individually, right? And then you have your end-to-end tests, which is more sort of, that probably includes a UI to some extent, right? There's different ways to go about it, right? For unit tests, there are great testing frameworks, and you can prompt it like vtest or jest. And if you prompt your agents to use either of these to always write the tests, then it can test the individual functions. When you're talking about sort of the end-to-end or the actual UI testing, I had an interesting conversation is that if you do your back-end testing, all your endpoints, routes, all your functionality, if you do that very, very well, I'm not sure sometimes it can be overkill to try and create complete front-end testing. It would be a nice, like everyone agrees that if you had the perfect test coverage, that would be amazing. Depending on the product you build and how quickly the front end changes, you will expend a lot of tokens, right? Because every time you make a small change, you need to have testing. So that really depends. So for the core features, it's good to use things like Playwright or other headless testing software to do that, or other tools within Replit or Lovable. But if it can be challenging if your UI is moving very, very quickly, and especially with the rate of changes that you make, it's still probably recommended to do it. Like, sure, if I were to say a recommendation, do your front-end testing, I think a lot of that can be caught if you have your functionality tested well.
And people, is it like Puppeteer? Like, are people using Puppeteer for automating front-end testing, some of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I would probably recommend Playwright over Puppeteer because it's better. Or now a stagehand, which is more AI focused and less around testing. So stagehand.dev, I think is the right one. But Playwright is a good example. I think there's also a lot more like purely browser-based remote API solution for that testing, which we don't use that much.
Yeah, well, and at one point, we don't have it at Props, but when I've been heavy in software development, even like a couple of years ago, we were, and sort of deep in the like multi-month build. I mean, we had, full on QA engineers who are like nonstop, both writing tests and, unit tests, and what it is a full-time job. Right. And going click by click by click, multiple browsers, multiple, I remember going to Best Buy and buying like 8 phones or something like that, like just so we could test all the different browsers across all the different phones, all the different mobile browsers across all the different phones and whatnot. And so, yeah, I'm excited for the testing side and how that starts to accelerate stuff as well, because it is a drag, right? And to do it right, it's got to be tested. So
yeah, it's incredibly important. And we've seen some of the bigger players kind of try and move to that. Like Browser Stack is a great example, right? Browser Stack has always been on that sort of multi-browser sort of testing side, and they're trying to push sort of their new, I don't know how old it is, but their AI powered automation testing tool. So basically,
I haven't seen that. That's awesome.
Yeah, I haven't tested it yet, but or similar, what I would actually love to use, that could be an interesting, fun product to build is, use Stagehand and basically use agents or use Stagehand as an MCP and have just Claude or whoever run your automated testing for you against your app in the scenarios and report that back. I think with like models like, the Gemini models being so dirt cheap now, like the Gemini, Flash 1.5 or whatever, which is totally sufficient. I think that becomes feasible to just test a lot of scenarios and testing in the UI quickly. I'm looking forward to see what comes out of that, really.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
We see that.
It's great.
Yeah, and it's a good point. So it's like you said, probably to some extent you still need a good QA part. Let's see how that changes in a month. That might be all. Another interesting thing is like if you have sort of your base, right? So you have a good planning, you have a design system in place, you have a little bit of, hopefully testing set up. So you know that your core features are covered as a vibe coder. Good starting point. Now, what I also see is most people don't think about sort of the production aspect of it and the scaling aspect of it. right? It's fascinating because I see a lot of these tools are still with vibe coding produce like local file storage or local file base, which obviously, like you said, on Replit is a bit of a different beast. Or like Lovable, for example, is powered by Superbase, so they have a lot of these bases well covered already. But there's a lot of things that people often don't think about, like when you have, especially when your product uses a lot of AI workflows or agent workflows. Like if you have an agent and the agent runs, right? So let's say you have your, I'm just gonna give a little robot placey here. So if you have your robot, right, and that robot might sort of do a task, right? Task. So task 1, right, and then it goes on and it does task 2, task 3, task 4. That that might take a while, right? And you might have a serverless function or something that takes care of that task, but it might also take a long time. Like some workflows might run for 6, 7, 8 minutes, right? They might run for a long time. So where do you run those processes effectively, right? Where do you actually do your like worker offloading background? How does that scale? Especially if it's like edge functions or other things, they will become very expensive for you, right? They might also block a lot of resources. So you're quickly in a territory where, and that's I think one of the big challenges with vibe coding, you're quickly in territory where you're spending thousands of dollars to, for the most basic things, which is interesting, right? So really thinking about sort of load testing, the scaling, and where to put it is super important regardless, right? Especially if you're thinking of taking a thing actually to production, making sure that thing actually runs the long running task without, bankrupting you quickly.
Yeah, that's one of those things I've heard this. That's one of those things I like about Replit. Replit has, you don't have to worry about deployment and infrastructure and whatnot. They're happy to take that piece for you, and they have some, some auto scaling rules and whatnot. We also like Heroku a lot. I know, but that's again, there's sort of a sophistication spectrum across all of the, whatever you're using for hosting, depending on, whether it's AWS or Heroku or all the way, or Superbase, as you mentioned.
Or like Vercel is a great play now in the arena,
Vercel.
obviously.
I was going to mention V0 is of course is a good one as well. And I think that, again, like all these tools sort of depend on the sophistication level that you want to operate in.
Yep.
And all the way from sort of something that's fairly basic all the way up to, very, 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 very complex stacks. So
yeah. How is your experience with Replit in terms of the feature set that you're integrating, right? I'm thinking if you go out in a more production scale environment and you go into, not something simple like a Stripe integration, but also maybe more complex background processes that are running. How's your experience with that? Have you played with any?
I've not played with any sort of like cron or anything like that. One of the things that I really like about Replit is it has like database on demand, very, built in. It has it's interesting. One of the things that it has a pretty good like environmental variables like and secrets way of capturing and securing that stuff, so that way it's not floating around in your code. And I really appreciate that about Replit, because I think that security on software is complex anyhow.
Mm-hmm.
And so the more that you don't have to worry about it, the best. And I've not found anything. It's interesting because it seems like it'd be a very easy problem to solve, which is security best practices being built in, right?
Yeah.
I ought to know if you're collecting an email address or other other identification type data. Like it ought to know how to handle that database without me telling it, that it like the requirements for securing that data. But I found the other day that it didn't. I was actually surprised, because it was like, it made the database. It worked great. And then I started looking under the hood, and I'm like, hold on, like the API and the endpoints for the API are wide open. Like nothing here is encrypted.
Was that using Replit?
That was using Replit, yeah. And so, once I called it out, it fixed it. But it was only because, I know that these are the things that we really need to watch out for, right?
Yeah.
I did not get as far as checking the JavaScript, right? And there's some, and this is a great segue, just talking about like some basic security harnessing that pretty much every app needs. And you have a background in security, so I'm really excited to sort of crack open security with you here a little bit.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm trying to go through this. Obviously, there's so many things when it comes to security, and there's a complex. It's a complex system. So maybe before we go into the sort of the solutions of it, like there's in terms of like problems. Some of the big challenges with like LLM and vibe coding is the probably the biggest one is you have the LLM cutoff date. So if you're working with a specific LLM, the training date is probably half a year back, right? Or 9 months. If you talk to like Anthropic talked that like their models are usually 9 months out before they actually get into production state. And what you have in security is you have your the security vulnerability lists. And the security vulnerabilities in every piece of software, every library that you use. So if you're working and creating your new vibe coded app, you're probably going to use at least 3, 5, 400, something like that packages in there, right? At a minimum. So, and there's vulnerabilities in those packages released daily, right? If not faster. So you can imagine what a 9-month cutoff does to the code that you're generating. You're basically generating code that has a security standard that is 9 months old.
9 months old. Wow.
Right?
Yep.
Think about that for a second, right? The repercussions of you using old, insecure code as a default. So companies like Replit and lots of others are trying to like figure that out and improve that. And how do you improve that, right? Now, what you can do is, and that's what we talked about before in the planning step, you start for every tool that you use, you attach documentation for the latest versions. You obviously install the latest version, right? So even though the LLM knowledge is older, you would still install the newest version to at least not have those security vulnerabilities. But then you have the issue that the LLM might not know how it works, right? Because the code of that package is newer than what the LLM knows how to work with. And that is like the core quintessential problem of that entire like coding with LLMs problem at the moment. So what can you do? Can you attach the latest documentation? Maybe you attach the latest security vulnerabilities into your context window or into the agent to actually have that make sense, right? So a big problem is the cutoff date is a big problem. So, outdated knowledge of software. You have the context window limit, right? So you can only attach a certain amount of things into your context when you're prompting an agent. If you cannot attach every single vulnerability related to any package into your context window. That's not going to work, right? It's going to explode it quickly. So the short answer is there's not really a hard and fast solution to this problem. It's a case-by-case basis, and it does require oversight in most of the cases, especially in critical areas. My general recommendation is, like, obviously there's lots of things. The first thing maybe that you want to start with is, use external providers, right? If you don't know what you're doing, right? That is like, super base for auth, etc. Like you would, why am I saying that? Because if you end up like implementing your own authentication, authorization, etc., you are going to work on old code and old, you're going to make mistakes. You can say for certain that this can be a security vulnerability down the road. So use external providers and push the liability on their side. It's still a risk, obviously, but you can rely on them at least, trying their best to keep that up to date on their end. That is one way to do it. Then that is sort of on the external front, everything you can externalize. Then in general, things that are very important is have rate limiting on your endpoints, right? Like all these API endpoints that you mentioned have rate limiting and basic security on it. What you can do if you want a good way to do that, or in general, a good way to like fend off DDoS attacks and everything that can come of you, there's this one lovely company called Cloudflare, which I would in general recommend for thwarting any sort of attacks. Have Cloudflare protection in front of your site, enabled by default for all the XSS injections, for all the DDoS attacks, everything. Now, when it comes to sort of your database, right, you need to have good, strong authorization. Interesting that you said that with like Replit. Replit does not default to Supabase for database at the moment, does it? Only Lovable does it, right?
Yeah.
So Supabase, for example, has this concept of like row level security, right? So you can have per row level security, as it says. So like Supabase runs on your front end client, so you want to have the right authorization rules. When you launch Supabase, it does not have those rules enabled by default. So think about your security rules, right? And prompt like who has access to what and why, right? Very important step, right? So if you have,
that makes sense.
A classic example, you have things in your database that only the user can see their own items, only the user can see their own data. That's the classical example. Only an admin can change this, only they can delete that. And if you go into production, or if you're actually trying to release, let's say, an iOS app, Apple is going to be, it's going to be the pain in your bum if you also don't solve things like reporting content. It's like if you have user-generated content in your app, right? You need report features, right? Anything report features for UGC and everything else that comes with it. And UGC, my friend, is everything. Your profile picture is also UGC. The name could be UGC, right? Everything that a user inputs into your system is a potential security risk that you need to think about and deal with and prompt the agent. And I don't want to be all hell here, right? It's very important to still stay calm, but it is very important that if you go production, think about it. Think about using the external providers for authentication, everything else. Think about rate limiting and protection through Cloudflare. Think about who has access to what in your database and what can and can't they do. And then think about how do you handle reporting and content oversight if there are user-generated things, inputs in your app. So I think that's really like just, that's a short classic example of security. There's tons of more things, but those are sort of on the high front. And I guarantee you, we've seen so many cases in vibe coding where none of that was present at all. Right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And you said it yourself, like even with Replit, who should deal with that now, it is a vast universe and it doesn't automatically do that for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it did a good job once I told it what I needed, but I was surprised that it didn't. And then that also, it has me worried a little bit about like other attack vectors, specifically like front end attack vectors, like through the JavaScript and some of that sort of stuff. I think it's helpful using Svelte or using libraries that are well known, using Vercel, using libraries that are well known and like you said, external providers, because I think that can help a lot versus from scratch, right? Is using well-worn paths and well-worn providers, because their reputation is also on the line, so they've already taking care of some of these problems. But it's interesting. It makes me actually, I wonder right now, like as we're talking about this, I'm like, there's got to be a service for vibe coders to get like an app security review. Like, it's like, because like, hey, can you just take a look and make sure that I'm not missing anything? There's got to be like, there's got to be a service. If there's not one already out there, then we got to start one, because it's like there's going to be so much where people are building and don't really quite know any of this stuff, and they know that they're not quite comfortable putting it out yet, and so are probably looking around for somebody to check their work, so to say.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's a big opportunity. I mean, look, The funny thing with like cybersecurity is it's still an afterthought for most people building it. That has fundamentally not changed, right? Because everyone is focusing on other things, and then it's risk mitigation at sort of the later end, which is obviously not what you should be doing. But I think now that we're going into an age where you have so many more people creating stuff all the time, this becomes utterly important to have at least a baseline, right? Because the amount, imagine the people who bring out their code, they might not have the sufficient legal protection. They might not have even thought about like properly incorporating it before they launch their Vibe Code app. And now if you have user data or other data exploited, you are liable, right?
Right.
So that can put people in a really tough spot. So not to scare the shit out of everybody here, but I think that is at least prompt the agent, figure out a way and have it think about the security so you get covered by, you have the basis covered before you go deeper. Yeah.
%. I mean, there's so much more here. I don't even know that we did. I think that there's still stuff on our agenda that we have not even touched yet. Unfortunately, carriage is getting ready to turn into a pumpkin, so I'm gonna have to.
We don't want to burn one, do it.
I'm gonna have to close it down. But this has been awesome, and we should do it again. I mean, I think this is a good topic, and I would love to get some other friends in the room to ask questions of us and whatnot, because I think there's a lot of people out there thinking about it, learning it, figuring it out, and I think it's a great time to sort of help people along that path.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a lot of fun. I think we covered a lot of things today.
Yeah, and so exciting this week, we're going to be launching the bonus link tool. And we'll take this video, put it through bonus link, and we're going to have all sorts of nuggets come out the other side. And so excited to share that with the world and whatnot, and excited to get into it. So thank you very much, Calvin. Really appreciate your time this afternoon for you, this evening for me. And we'll see you on the flip side. Okay, man?
Exciting. It's been fun, Dave. See you around.
All right. See ya.
Bye.